Tactics and Practice podcast.
Dobar dan, everyone, and welcome to the Tactics and Practice podcast, the audio extension of Aksioma Institute for Contemporary Art's discursive program of the same name, focusing on investigative art, society, and new technologies. This podcast series is part of the 16th edition of Tactics and Practice called Are You a Software Update? I am Neja Berger. I'm hosting this season in which we're examining self-updating mechanisms of contemporary techno-social systems, and we're looking particularly for theoretical trajectories outside the usual and well-established academic and theoretical critiques tied to platform analysis and frameworks of surveillance. In Unreal Data, Real Effects, the season I've hosted in 2024, we talked about quantification and datafication and algorithmic systems, but then towards the end of the season we started exploring ways of exiting reality. In Valentina Tani's words, we started exploring this insane world of internet lore and vernacular and aesthetics, and seeing that maybe within its cracks or its back rooms there's still that space to maneuver that is not saturated with extractive platform logic. Or even if it is, we asked, what can we find in the glitches? And in this new season, we're going to continue that exploration, maybe asking what can we do in the glitches? And we'll start thinking about it with our first guest, Sophie Publig, Digital Ecosystem Explorer based at the Peter Weibel Institute for Digital Cultures, University of Applied Arts, Vienna. Hello.
Hi.
Welcome to the Aksioma Tactics and Practice podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're really happy to talk to you. Let's get into it. So on this podcast, we talked about memes. We talked about certain memes, and we talked about memes as parts of digital aesthetics. But we've never really talked memes, not least with someone who has a PhD in memes, which you do. Goals. For me personally, when I started doing some meme research a while ago or reading up on it, I've always struggled to find a definition of memes where not everything is also kind of a meme, or you couldn't say that everything is also a meme. So I thought we could go through these most established definitions of memes in academia and outside maybe, and then from then on we can move toward your framework of defining memes within this critical post-humanities framework that you use.
Sounds lovely. Yeah, I'd love to. Regarding your frustration on a good definition of memes, I can just say same girl, because I was running into the same issue when I started doing meme research, which was actually during the pandemic. Also when I had to switch to online teaching, which was kind of, a challenge to keep the students motivated to zoom in to every session weekly. So I started to look with them at memes, basically. And as you probably anyone knows at this point, originally the term meme was coined by Richard Dawkins, who is like an evolutionary biologist and diehard member of the rationalist movement. So he coined the term in 1976 in his book The Selfish Gene, where he actually tried to make a stance for genetics, because genetics wasn't very well established back then in biology. It was kind of a new field. And in order to make this idea of the gene more popular and more prominent, he came up with the meme, which is basically the analogy of the gene, but for culture. So you can already see that there's some nature-culture divide going on in this definition. But because he made this case for the gene as a unit of information, basically storing the DNA, he also said that, hey, we have the same thing going on in culture, where we have a unit of cultural transmission or cultural information, or he also called it a unit of imitation. So this sounds very abstract still, but he gave an example, a recipe, right, which has this kind of manual instructions on how to cook a dish. and can be imitated and can be mutated and can be changed a little bit, but basically stays the same over time and always gives you the same dish when you prepare it accordingly. So that was kind of where the original meme came from.
Yeah. I'm always astonished by the confidence of these early memeticists and Dawkins enthusiasts because, okay, so the selfish gene was published, what year did you say?
Yeah,
It was in the
1976.
70s. Yeah, 1976. But then towards the end of the millennium, so like late 90s, early 2000s, there was this journal of memetics that tried to kind of establish a science of memetics based on Dawkins's analogy to evolutionary biology or to memes as analogous to genes. And it was kind of a fail, but but what I want to point out, and I'm being mean, but the whole memetics movement, or at least the beginning of it or some parts of it, is really giving biologists who have never read any social sciences, humanities, anthropology, being like, what separates people, or no, of course, they wouldn't say people, they would say, what separates man from animals is in fact culture.
Exactly.
And therefore, we must study culture. And they essentially thought that they discovered anthropology all over again centuries later, I suppose, and ran into similar problems that anthropology that had been trying to develop a theory of how culture spreads and develops and how essential or non-essential it is and if it develops linearly or not, had stumbled upon, like I said, a century earlier. And the definition and the framework of memetics is actually very similar to a school of anthropology, the diffusionists, who also propose that these units of culture spread through interaction and exchange and force, and they try to track it by looking at culture as these separate little elements and track how they spread. So in a sense, very similar to what memeticists tried, but the critiques that apply to the diffusionists also apply to the memeticists, and these critiques were written about, again, much earlier. And they're mostly about the fact that you really can't divide culture into little units because they could always be divided even more parts of more complex structures, and no unit really exists without the connection to the other units. And even if they were, they're not spread by imitation as something like recognizable and discrete that we could actually track, because it would keep this unique identity or form that would be the same, and then it would just be resting in someone's brain and another, and you could recognize it.
Exactly.
So I think the same critiques kind of caught up with the Journal of Memetics, which then finally died in 2005.
Yeah, which I always found really funny because that's kind of when internet memes became really big, right? It's a weird coincidence. But yeah, true. I mean, the whole study of memetics, it was really big in the 90s. And it was also very much discussed among, I mean, they had a lot of people from psychology, for example, there. Like Susan Blackmore was an important member of the memeticists movement, but also more cognitive science related philosophers like Daniel Dennett, for example. But yeah, what they essentially try to do is to kind of biologize culture and kind of just analyze it according to the same factors as evolutionary biology, And while they were following, of course, a Darwinian interpretation of evolution, it was very reductionist and it lacked a lot of the nuance that would exactly come from cultural studies and anthropology, for example, because they tried to put it in such an objective framework where exactly I feel like in cultural studies, this just doesn't hold up because you have so many situated forms of cultural gestures like humor and irony, which you cannot account for if you're trying to make a hard science study out of it. And I guess that's also why they died out. Although I also read that especially in the framework of biology, memetics was still an ongoing thing throughout the 90s until, there was this shift which was more towards cultural biological co-evolution. That's kind of when, probably most scientists were agreeing, okay, maybe we don't do one thing or the other, but we're trying to merge them more. And I think that goes into the right direction and kind of leaves this very strict and reductive framework of memetics.
Exactly. And as you said, around the time that the Journal of Memetics stopped existing, internet users actually started using this term meme by themselves, right? Kind of like an in vivo term. And they did pick it up from Dawkins.
Definitely.
Yeah, as a reference. But yeah, even meme studies in academia later, as it would develop, was a lot or is a lot more successful now that it's focusing on something that the users themselves recognized, and it didn't have a name yet, and they termed it meme, willing it to be forever connected to the original memetics somehow. But I'd be interested to ask, what was happening in the early 2000s on Reddit and 4chan when this term started being used?
Yeah, well, a lot. And I would argue it goes even further because I think also that's why I alluded to this like rationalist ideology that was propelled by people like Dawkins, because that was also a kind of ideology that was very much received online in the early news groups and message board cultures of the 90s. So there was a lot of reception of, for example, Dawkins' theories and other neo-rationalist movement stuff. And I guess that's where they picked up on the meme. Also because there was already a dynamic going on back then in the mid-90s, which had to do with just what we call the in and out group phenomenon. So basically you have a community online, for example, talking to each other on a specific news group or a message board. And of course, they will have some kind of cultural codes and some forms of in-jokes that they share among themselves, but don't really want to share with anyone outside of that community, even though it's online, right? And in theory, anyone with an internet access could access that. But what actually happens is that communities have like their own language and their own forms of humor and their own insiders to kind of separate from the bigger mainstream in that online web world. And that's what we call the in-group then. And they're defined by like seeing and recognizing each other through these memes, for example. Somebody posts something and others add to it, and then it becomes like their in-joke. But to someone who has not been a part of that or does not know about that, they would have no idea what is going on and what they're talking about. You can see it in this like very classical subcultural tradition of splitting from the mainstream and having your own like thing going on. And that is something that pretty much is important to the dynamics of meme cultures up to this day, where we can still see that people will maybe encounter a meme and be like, I just don't get it. But somebody else who like knows the reference, right, will find it funny as fuck. So that's kind of how the rhythm came into being. And that was then just continued on the early image boards like 4chan and Something Awful. And then, of course, spreading over once we had bigger message boards like Reddit, for example.
And just continuing to track for now how memes were studied, maybe we can now mention the, I guess, more mainstream cultural studies definition of memes, or the most cited one, I suppose, which would be Schiffman's definition.
Exactly. So Lemur Schiffman's definition came in 2014, and I think it marks the first prominent academic analysis of memes. And Schiffman, as far as I'm aware, is a sociologist or sociolinguist, actually. And she was studying memes really as the classic phenomena of the late 2000s and early 2010s. So we're talking like classic YouTube culture, classic rage comics, image macros, you name it. So really like once memes hit the mainstream because social media platforms emerged and they were much easier to share. And that's also, I think, the most important component of her definition is that she defines them as digital items that share common form, content, and ideologies, which are in correspondence with one another, and they are shared on the internet and also, of course, mutated on the internet. So we can see that there's this big shift now in the definition of memes, accounting for the dynamics of web cultures. basically. And I mean, Schiffman in her definition even went so far that she was like, there's no need to talk about memes in terms of any biological frameworks. We don't care about that. The methods of sociology and of cultural studies are enough to analyze memes, which I find also very interesting because that's like the opposite of what Dawkins did, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. And this definition just kind of stresses only the agency of users, and then the memes become this completely passive tool, I guess, which anyone who has done things with memes would probably feel weird about because they are powerful in their own way. In my view, this early memetics definition will always inevitably remain kind of sticky in any meme studies because if not anything else, it's always cited. If you look at the networks of research citations, it's always cited either because it's just the OG definition or cited to be criticized. But even then, some aspects and some concepts and maybe also some problems, like the porosity of the definition, the fact that it kind of engulfs a lot of other things than just what the users maybe perceive as memes, stick. But what I personally think can be productive from this memetics, like the memetics history that sticks in meme studies, is exactly this drive of focusing still actually on the meme, not always the user. So this memetics idea of focusing on what the meme wants or how the meme spreads. And this is where the memetic leftovers in meme studies are actually interesting. They're potentially productive. And yeah, this is something that we could maybe even say could drive us toward a post-humanist framework.
Yes.
If we acknowledge the agency of memes, but aren't Dawkins pilled in the way that...
Exactly.
So no, that's just why I really love your take on memes.
Thanks for like summarizing and wrapping that up so nicely because yeah, that's like totally the biggest critique towards Dawkins was like, oh, okay, if memes are using the human brain basically as a vessel or, just to spread and stay alive, so to say, and to continue to proliferate, then where's the agency of the human there, right? Because how do you mutate then? Does the meme just decide by itself that, oh, this time we're going to do the recipe differently, right? It doesn't really work like that. It doesn't really hold up to that. And of course, with Schiffman's definition, then you can basically say that definition could be any kind of thing that is online, any kind of cultural product, basically. So there's also no big need here to involve any kind of other framework, anything that could account really for mutation, except for human users, basically. And I don't know, I was like really bothered by coming from a background that is drawing heavy on post-humanist theory. I was really bothered by having this either or binary situation of having either the nature argument from Dawkins or the culture only argument by Schiffman. And I was also, when I started writing my thesis in 2020, I was also like, okay, this is so not up to date, because there was this whole discussion going on about the Anthropocene and about the post-apocalypse and the post-human. And it was clear that nature culture binary is just an arbitrary divide that has no real existence. And post-human theory has made such strong cases for that. So it's like, okay, well, how can we think this differently? And how can we maybe find something that does not hinge on a binary opposition, but basically merges that? And that's how I then encountered, actually through also still sticking to like biology literature, Lynn Margulis's idea of symbiosis, right? Or like of symbiosis in her case, where she already back in the 70s was strongly claiming that it is not competition that is driving evolution. So it's not just like classic misreading of Darwin that only the fittest will survive, but it is actually cooperation and collaboration between different species, between different organisms that produce new species. So she showed that with the emergence of the eukaryotic cell, how different bacteria came together, and the cell did not just develop new characteristics and new organs, but it was actually the specific different bacteria that came together, collaborated, and created a new organism that had many more characteristics. Wow. and yeah, that was then later picked up by Donna Haraway in this idea of symbiosis, which also riffs on another biology concept called autopoiesis. In autopoiesis, it was proposed that life works as a closed system. And symbiosis is breaking that up a little bit because, again, if you have just a lot of closed systems next to each other, how do you mutate? How do you create a new organism? How do you actually have something new happening unless there's like some crash out? And in symbiosis, it was the idea that these systems are not necessarily closed, but they're like porous. They have open boundaries. And through that, they can actually merge with others or like bleed into others and collaborate and cooperate, basically. And there was this idea also that was pretty big of devouring or engulfing another species, another creature. And on that basis, you can create something together. And I think that's also how like Haraway is introducing the term. She's like writing, symbiosis is a simple term. It means making with. And when I read that, I was like, oh, this could actually also be highly relevant to memes, right? Because it's not about who just creates the meme or what the meme does once it goes online and goes viral, but it's about all the interactions in between that are actually how a meme behaves. So I was very interested then in looking at memes as these symbiotic life forms that actually combine users, platforms, because that's the environment that they thrive in, and the cultural gestures or the cultural references that are being negotiated in them. So that is then how I would define a meme, is that it actually is about this dynamic and this interplay between these different agents, which produces a meme, but it always kind of stays connected also in its primary ecosystem where it comes from. So just to explain that more thoroughly, you could have something like a line of text, right? Which is a keyword, like, you know, the girls that get it, right? Then you have an image, for example, that is connected to that or not. But once you put them together, you're creating something new, cooperating in a new way. And then you kind of share that with the ecosystem, with the community. And it could be received, it could not be received, but all of these things influence in how the meme can actually, what it can become, basically. And from there, this could also be an audio, a viral audio and a video, or some song and a dance choreography or something. But all of them then merge together, create something new that is like set afloat online. And from there, it will mutate and change. And that is kind of how I understand memes coming into being.
I love that. And I feel like, at least for me, it kind of calms me down in relation to like the ontology of memes, overcoming the obstacle of viewing them solely as this automatic evolutionary mechanism deterministically, but without relying on the cultural studies obsession with just representation, I guess. So yeah, that's memes as symbiotic agents by Sophie Publig. Would recommend. Before we do move on, though, we still have this, well, it's not a problem, but just the defining memes as something and then asking what would not be that thing remains, in the sense that if we think about other things like ideas or trends or genres or book or anything, would not everything be a symbiotic agent? Going back to this original, like, not issue, but just the thing with definition of memes, where it's hard to set it without encompassing everything.
I think you totally like got me here, because of course, once you try to define something, it will be on the basis of exclusion. So that's why I tried to make a definition that is very broad, because when I did that, we could also see the shift in digital cultures from more static images that were for the longest time what people would think of when they think of memes, right, towards short video content. And that had the problem that especially in academic meme research, which is always a little bit late to the party, that most people would say, oh no, TikToks are not memes, right? They're like short video content. But why would they not be memes? They behave in the exact same way. They do the same to like users and people. And that's why I was opting for a definition that is actually as inclusive as possible. Because the other big shift that we've been seeing more recently is, of course, AI-generated memes, right? There have been a lot of, not just of people generating or creating memes using image gen, but also of actually people writing code for AI-generating memes, basically, with captions as well. And that could be another problem then when you don't have a very inclusive definition of memes, that you would always, when something new comes up, which will inevitably, because we're talking the internet, right? And something new comes up every day, that couldn't then be considered a meme. And that's kind of why I try to keep it as broad as possible, which of course then comes at the flaw of what we do when we talk about memes that are created by marketing companies, for example. Memes that have been created especially with some monetary profit in mind. And because most of the time users don't relate to them as well, because they have this allure of being force-fed a little bit and they're just not funny. But I mean, technically it's still a meme, right? So there are these very porous, very gray zones in that definition as well. But I would rather have that than have the problem of not being able to account for something new coming up, being considered a meme. So that's where I was coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's still my top favorite way to talk about memes and to define memes. So you mentioned how companies use memes, or we have whole governments using memes. We have meme wars.
Yeah.
And I think we could ascribe that to the fact that memes are powerful, right?
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
That they have an influence on people, which is why I'm also very interested in researching memes in this season as we try to look for surface strategies in the cracks, like I said. So memes seem to be loaded with a certain activating potential, we can say, with a sort of invitation to participate in the meme, but not in a way of being forced or of being encouraged. It's just the participation itself is the meme in a way. Mm-hmm. So that's also where this political charge of memes comes from.
Yes.
And another aspect of it is rooted in trolling.
Mm-hmm.
And I love the section of your PhD where you discuss the role of trolling in these early internet features and meme development. So you could talk us through that a little bit to account for this activating potential or the encouragement to participate, to be a part of something in a sort of seductive, fun way that still resonates today in the meme wars and meme politics.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I could go on forever about that, but I'll try to keep it short. If we, again, look at like the origins of memes online, then you will inevitably come to troll wars, basically, right? And trolling as a practice, which again has already been happening in the early to mid 90s, where people would already dox each other online just because of some disagreement over something. So pretty much the same dynamics we see on Twitter today. Mm-hmm. But there, of course, memes were spawned off in that whole fighting dynamics or disagreement dynamics because people were trying to make a point with making a joke. And it's much easier to transfer a joke in an image or in a specific tagline or snow clone that can be imitated and mutated and then creates its own life. And like trolling was, especially if you think about when people started to go online broadly, I would say late 90s, early 2000s, once we had broadband internet, throwback, yay, then you can really see that you suddenly have a lot of people online that don't really know how to like act online. So they would just treat it like any offline space. And that's something that trolls were like very much targeting. So what they were doing is you had a like section at least of troll culture that were really obsessed with actually a form of what we could call media literacy. Basically just telling people that being online is the same thing as being in a public space. You wouldn't just do the things you do at home, right? And you wouldn't share your most personal information online because anyone can find it. And that is one side, for example, that was really important for the early shock websites. If you remember like rotten.com or Okretič, right? I mean, throwback to the millennials that listen to this. You could actually see that they had on their website, on rotten.com, a disclaimer saying that, yeah, we do not take responsibility on whoever finds this website. Don't let your kids go online by themselves. That's the same thing as letting them roam around the streets of New York City by themselves. So there's this almost pedagogical element to it, which I find hilarious. And, you know, that trolls would go to like great lengths to defend. So you had this kind of branch. And then on the other side, you also had a lot of the beginning of like the media sensationalism in the 2000s, which was also led to this whole fake news or like post-truth paradigm that we are finding ourselves in today. And that's basically when media news outlets would just cover any sort of news in order to make the internet look bad, just jump on any train. And a lot of trolls have been targeting big news agencies. I think Fox News was a prominent victim of trolling in the 2000s, where they would just feed them like false information to just show that journalists would cover anything for clout, right? And anything for outreach. And a lot of the times they were like fed wrong stories or hoaxes that would then be reported on as if they were true. And there you can really see that there's a big interest in the attribution on what is true and what is not. There is this weird potential of stuff to be believed in, even though it has no backing facts, because, well, some authority, like media outlet, is saying so. And that is something that trolls would also target. Later then, of course, this would swap over in the whole culture on 4chan regarding Anonymous and the trolling of, for example, the Church of Scientology, but also of politicians, other online communities, and so on and so on. So this kind of became a thing in itself, which I think really set the baseline for today.
Yeah, the vibe is that these tools at the beginning at least were leveraged more or mostly by right-wing political groups, right? Or is it, I mean, you could say that the tools are politically ambivalent themselves, but what's the political history of the movements connected to memes and trolling? Or I suppose we have arrived to the age-old question of, can the left meme?
Exactly. I mean, that's like the billion-dollar question, right? Because obviously everything, even as media scholars, like most internet users are anonymous. We can't really say what kind of identities they have or like what kind of ideologies they adhere to. But in the case of trolls and like their constant, whining about the right for free speech, we can probably say that they're like based in North America and probably at least libertarian. So that is making this huge comeback also at the moment, or maybe it was never really gone. I don't know. But a lot of trolls definitely had this idea that I can say what I want to say without consequences. This is my right. And that is, of course, something that you might not find as much among the left wing. It's really hard to say. I'm really trying to stay away from the narrative of saying that all trolls were right wing, because I just don't think it's true. I think that is also often like mixed up with this love for transgression that trolls have, right? They love to like push the boundaries of what is good taste, and they just really thrive in these more extremist milieus and really try to basically get any reaction, because of course this like saying of don't feed the troll, right, has a very clear meaning, which is you can only get trolled if you engage with it, basically, because anyone can send you some shit online. That doesn't mean that you have to like pay attention to it and basically feed the troll in that sense. And I do believe that at some point there was a big shift, which we can probably place somewhere in the like mid 2010s, where of course a lot of trolls were already immersing themselves maybe in things that are like distinctly right-wing leaning, would actually also become right-wing supporters. Whether ironically or not, doesn't really matter. Once you vote for the right, you vote for the right. And I think that is especially the kind of thing that is riffed on when we're talking about the so-called meme wars, right? Of the basically everything that has to do with leading up to the election of Donald Trump as a US American president in 2016. And that is this idea of the culture wars that is transmitted via, or like comes into being via memes, where you basically have trolls and right-wingers on the same side. And again, I guess a lot of people who have been posting back then on 4chan and then later the whole 8chan and QAnon thing, maybe did that also ironically. And they thought it was funny to be a Trump supporter or whatever. But in the end, that kind of became the timeline that we are in now. So I would say they would be at least playing in the same team.
Oh, yeah. Love our timeline.
Amazing, yeah.
But no, it is because throughout these seasons, we are going to be talking about online phenomena and these service strategies. But I do want to ground it down to how we can think about politics with these mechanisms. Mm-hmm. And just an example, can you remind me, because that was for me, I always thought that was just such a beautiful example of what the power of trolling or meme action can do. What exactly happened when the situation was when trolls low-key ruined a hedge fund? Do you know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. You mean the GameStop short squeeze? Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, of course. And I think, yeah, that's exactly the point, right? It's not so much about the like methods or the act of trolling itself. You could say, okay, it's still transgressive. It may be bad taste. It might be a little bit unethical or whatever, but it's not distinctly ideological on any side of the spectrum, right?
No, I think we could claim some of its tactics, not necessarily the whole trolling culture, but that ruining a hedge fund, like, we love.
Absolutely. Yeah, no. And I mean, that very much started as a Reddit thing, basically. I think it was back in like 2021. It was this one YouTuber, I think his name was Roaring Kitty. And he found out that a lot of actual hedge fund managers were trying to short squeeze, basically push out of the market GameStop. And basically were like betting on the stock market against GameStop in order to drive them out of business, because they were like, oh, okay, the future of gaming is going to be digital anyway. We don't need actual video game stores anymore. And this will go downhill. So why don't we just group together and make it quick? And then basically we earn a lot of money while kicking them out of the market. But this one YouTuber picked up on that. And he was one of these people super into trading. And he shared that with his community, more kind of amateur traders. And they all started to buy a lot of GameStop stocks. And that was, of course, driving up the price of GameStop stocks enormously high. And that led to a lot of people on Wall Street losing a lot of money in a very short time, to such an extent that there was actually the app that they were using was banned then by the US American government, or at least, some of its functions were rendered unavailable. Because in the end, it's fine to drive other companies out of business if you're doing it from Wall Street. But if you're doing it from a Reddit server, it's not okay. That was the moral of the story. And yeah, a lot of people, really like normal users, made money off of that. A lot of them donated stuff. A lot of them also got into financial ruin due to this. But it was a really great moment in time to witness community holding together against these pressures, not just from the governmental side, but also from the financial side, and basically sticking together, creating a bunch of memes along the way to keep that company GameStop alive. And of course, also to prove a point against Wall Street.
So speaking of activating potentials in the network. We are moving on to the final section of our conversation now on the topic of your forthcoming paper on network spirituality, NetSpeak, which you could broadly think of as online subcultures that blend spirituality and internet aesthetics and esotericism. But I would love to ask Sophie to explain NetSpeak for normies.
For sure. I mean, basically, it really is just a buzzword that was created as an umbrella term by a lot of the proponents of the movement itself to capture this vibe shift, as it has been called, that has been happening towards esoteric phenomena, towards understanding, for example, users as angels on the network, sending messages, and on a very broad scale, understanding the network or being online as a kind of spiritual epiphany. So there's this idea that the network is a spiritual guide or something that actually resonates with the spiritual world offline, so to say, which ties back to the whole Christian Gnostic tradition, but also to a lot of influences from Kabbalah, a lot of also very problematic right-wing esotericism that has been influencing that, and has a mashup of different esoteric traditions coming together and creating this belief. And this vibe shift has been dated back to, I think, 2020, 2021. You could also say, okay, people got really bored during the pandemic, and that created, I think, a lot of very chronically online people and determined a lot of the ways in which users would then engage with like occultism and esotericism online. And you could see that in the more, let's say, mainstream kind of things like the Tumblr witches, for example, that actually predate the pandemic. You could also see that in things like TikTok tarot, when you basically get a video on your For You page where somebody is laying tarot cards and are like, this video uses no hashtags, and if it found you on your For You page, it's because it's trying to tell you something. This is a sign from the universe, kind of like that. Mm-hmm. And of course, the whole turn towards astrology. But this has also been adhering to some really problematic origins and also spawned off a lot of very weird kind of phenomena like actual self-harm cults online or apparent ones, because of course, everything gets debunked all the time. And very weird ideas also about racist trajectories and a lot of misogynism again. Also basing that a little bit in the troll tradition, but that usually is specific pillars. The movement in general is way too broad to adhere it to any ideology or side.
Mm-hmm. So you've described NetSpeak's signs from the universe mentality, like TikTok tarot or affirmative image macros manifesting that financial independence. But this is all tied to the concept of hyperstition. And I'd love to ask you, how does this concept transform from an avant-garde 90s theory into today's algorithmic manifestation / digital prayer / commenting I affirm under a Miley Cyrus meme? Can you unpack the connection?
One of the things that has been really influential for how we understand spirituality and occultism today, that is engaging with it online, is the tradition of the CCIU, of the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, that has been active in the 90s to mid 2010s at the University of Warwick. And people that were involved with them were like Mark Fisher, Sadie Plant, Nick Land, Maya B. Chronic, and so on. And one of their central concepts, because they already engaged a lot with occult traditions, a lot with post-structuralist philosophy, and of course with the computer and the online. And one of their central concepts is this idea of hyperstition. I think they define it as a kind of element of affective culture that makes itself real. And I think it's easiest to kind of understand it in terms of writing, as if you write about something, whether that's theory or fiction, doesn't really matter, to write it into being or write it into becoming. And you could maybe reduce that to a kind of manifestation to make things real. And I think that's what a lot of people that have been dealing with spirituality now have been referencing when they're doing these. Maybe you remember from the pandemic, the affirmations account on Instagram, which has also been putting out these like image macros with, I remember one with this Miley Cyrus image with the blue eyes there going like, I will not ask my parents for money, manifesting financial independence, or I will get out of bed today. These kind of, very low scale, very non-committal, very post-ironic engagements with manifestation or mantras. And that's definitely been a thing that has been received a lot, right? So a lot of the comments in the comment section will always read like, I affirm, to kind of show like the interest or being part in that. And that has been definitely a staple in that movement that has basically a little bit also of this brain rot schizopost style to it. Because when you think about it, when you just affirm everything, you basically are behaving like a kind of cult member. And just, it's again going a little bit against actual discourse and actual critical thinking skills. It's more like, ooh, I'm this node in the network and I just affirm everything and everything will be great.
So you mentioned the low stakes game of affirmation dressed as memes, dressed in this post-ironic vibe or aesthetic. But what I really love about your research in this upcoming paper on network spirituality is you also show how this post-irony is a great way to weaponize the supposed ambivalence and cover destructive content with it, or self-harm content or extreme right-wing ideas in this aesthetic of not really meaning it. What even is real? I'm so meta-edgy schizo posting.
Yeah, I mean, that, of course, is an inheritance from these like mid-2000s post-ironic trolls endorsing Trump and whatever. Mm-hmm. Because, I mean, that's kind of also what is so bothersome about at least some proponents of this movement is because if you actually take something like hyperstition seriously and adhere to it, why would you manifest super bad stuff or just like unethical evil shit if you have the power to do better? But there you can see that this is not really taking seriously, or is just not very consequential. And that's also what happens when post-irony and theory mix. The reception of it is very superficial. Mm-hmm. And the same is true then for memes, of course, because you can easily reference something in a meme that you picked up somewhere, but maybe it has some origins that are really dark and grounded in 19th century racist theory, for example, or has been really used in far-right contexts for a really long time. But because it's only received on the surface or only received as an aesthetic, it kind of loses that grounding a little bit and can actually be used to spread more evil content on that sense. So I think this is where this whole post-irony thing leaves a cultural void a little bit, or maybe it's an ethical void rather, because there is no interaction with actual content. It's just about sharing. It's just about affirming. But it's not really about engaging with anything that lies beneath that. And that's a great way to hijack movements, as we could see what happened with the right wing and the whole Trump election thing, and now it's happening again. It's like, of course, I love laughing about some of the memes or whatever, but what it's really doing, it's like spreading attention to them, to the right-wingers, for example. And that's the problem with the whole, or maybe it's more of a double-edged sword of politics online, because you can easily be roped into something without really actually being in a know. And I think these are the biggest dangers, because by now, a lot of memes have very radical origins, right? And it has always been that way. But now the rabbit holes have gotten so deep that it's really easy to just be dragged into something that you might not actually support in the first place. But if you continue to surround yourself with that inside your echo chamber, you just start believing in that. We could see that happen to a lot of users with the whole Andrew Tate's misogynist content, for example. Maybe these people weren't even hating women in the first place, but after a while, they just start picking up that behavior. And that's how quick these things tend to go.
Yeah, thank you for discussing memes and Netsby, and we've already been talking longer than we said we would, but really just for the very end, I need to have a recorded version of this anecdote that you told me in Ljubljana at some point. So we maybe end on a slightly lighter note about your paper that we just discussed. When you were translating these really specific internet vernacular terms that are established in English, like God-pilled or certain snow clones, into German, you got some interesting comments on the peer review.
Yeah, I mean, this is also like no shade or anything. And obviously, this is going to be anonymous. But yeah, no, it was really a fun thing to see that also it's so fast, right? Everything that is like going online, that when you then bring it to actual academic journals, they have no idea what you're talking about. And I think my favorite comment was I had a subheading in that saying the girls who get it, and the girls who don't. And there was a comment on that. Is that some kind of inside joke that I'm not getting? And it's like, yes, girl, I'm sorry it is.
That's beautiful. Yeah. I mean, beautifully ironic. Yes. What a great way to conclude. I mean, the girls who get it, the girls who don't. And we sincerely hope that we made sense to all of the girls listening. Thank you so much, Sophie.
Thank you, Neja. Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
And that's it for this episode. Thank you for listening. Are You a Software Update is a series of podcasts conceived and conducted by myself, Neja Berger, for the 16th edition of Tactics and Practice, the discursive program of the Aksioma Institute for Contemporary Art, curated this year by Nora, Murchú, Socrates, Stamatatos, Janez, Fakin, Janša, and me. For more information on the context, participants, and partners involved, see the links in the description. This episode was recorded and edited by me. The music and audio post-production were taken care of by Gašper Torkar, and the project coordination by Marcela Okretič. You're welcome to visit aksioma.org, where you'll find a wealth of free content. If you like what we do, you can also support us by making a donation. And that's it for today. See you next week. Greetings from Ljubljana and na svidenje.
Tactics and Practice podcast.